So, guys, let's talk a little bit about what sorts of things the Romans achieved. We've talked about some of the great things that all of these different groups in the ancient times have achieved, like the pyramids and the Parthenon. So, what are some things that the Romans achieved that in turn we have also sort of adopted or we use today? We're going to skip a couple of things on here and just sort of hit on the important ones for today. So, I just wanted to show you guys this. There's a whole story that we could go through, and we sometimes we'll read part of this short story, but this is actually a terracotta statue. So it's pretty small, like it would fit maybe on like a table. And it's made out of terracotta, probably terracotta, which you know about. Think about like the orange pots that you buy, the clay ones at the nursery. That's the same type of thing that this was actually carved out of. Now you can see that over time, there's definitely some wearing of the faces here that, they don't have everything going on, but it's 2,000 years old. So the fact that we still have this at all is pretty impressive. But I wanted to show you, this is from the first century, so 2,000 years ago. It's still in pretty good condition, and you can see that the workmanship is pretty good as well. So let's talk about some other arts and architecture. Over here, we have something called a mosaic. So a mosaic is made up of taking small pieces of colored glass and arranging them to create a picture. So if you were to look at this really closely, you would actually see that there's all these little tiny squares that make up this picture. I think mosaics are very difficult to accomplish. I remember having to do one in art class. Maybe you guys have done one in art class at some point. But their art is definitely detailed, even with these little tiny pieces of glass. So what would they use mosaics for? You might see mosaics just as a picture that might be put on the wall. So just very simply as a decoration. A lot of times they actually used it on the floor when you would, like, say, first walk into a lobby of one of the government buildings or something. You might have seen a gigantic mosaic on the floor. So it definitely would have taken some time to get that all created. In terms of sculpture, this is a sculpture of Augustus. So remember, Octavian and Augustus are the same guy. And in their sculpting, they really wanted to show realism. So they wanted to really make it look as realistic as possible. And some of these sculptures that we'll look at throughout history are so realistic that I swear they could just start moving or talking to you. So you can see, for example, one of my favorite things is always to look at their hair. Like, look at the detail in those locks of hair. You can definitely see the time and effort that went into it. You can see the carving on his chest plate. So this would have been part of his military uniform. And there's definite detail. Of course, they also would have had that on his actual uniform. So that's a whole nother area of artistic ability that they had. His face is very detailed. It is proportionate. If we go back to the Egyptians, in their art, they didn't seem to understand depth and depth perception. So the feet were always facing sideways. The torsos were always facing forward, and then the heads were always facing sideways. So if you look at a picture of an Egyptian, they look very flat. This definitely does not have that. They are definitely going for the depth on this one. So you can see that their sculptures are very realistic. They were probably also usually done, this particular one, for example, would have been life-size. And then, of course, we've got their architecture. So I love architecture. I love being able to see how different places created their buildings and how different they are from place to place. Years ago, when I took an art history class, one of the things we actually had to do on our test, on our final, was to look at different columns and different parts of buildings, and we had to tell which time period and which region of the world it came from. So when you travel from place to place, there are things that might overlap, but these different civilizations definitely had their own unique tone and different things that they did. So we're looking at a picture of what's left of the Colosseum. One thing I want to point out to you guys is look at these people across the bottom. This totally gives you a sense of how gigantic this building is. It is huge. Those people are like miniature next to this picture. So definitely this is a huge, grand building. And their architecture focused on being very grand or very large. It wasn't even just the large size, it also was very grand in terms of the detail that they put into it. They had a lot of columns and arches. So we've already talked about columns. Those were the big pieces that were on the Parthenon. And arches. Arches are a big deal here. I've mentioned in some of the classes these arches and how they discovered that an arched walkway like this is actually stronger than having a squared off door frame like most of our doors are. So they found that they could build larger and more grand and taller because they were using these archways instead of just the square pieces. So you see here, the square ones, the windows here, they're all the way at the top. So they're not supporting all of the weight, the same as the ones down here. They also had domed roofs, which this does not because there is no roof on this one, but we will look at some pictures that will show you what that dome looks like. So there is a dome right back here. This is the Pantheon, not to be confused with the Parthenon. I know they sound similar. Couple of things. So not only does it have this dome on the back, but even this entire backside of this building is rounded. So it kind of allows for that domed roof to fit on there. We've got columns. Again, you can see that these people nearby, that this is really, truly a gigantic building. Again, the columns are smooth. They are not fluted on the sides the way that we saw on the Parthenon. And if you look at the tops of these columns, you can see the decorative carving that's going on there. So like I mentioned, different places and different time periods actually did their architecture similar, but had these differences. So a lot of the arches, or rather the columns in Greece, they might have scrolly things on the top of them, or even just be plain blocks stacked up. This is very ornate in its carving, particularly on these corner pieces here. You can also see that there are definitely Roman letters here. These are letters that you actually can see, right? Because these look like our letters, so we can recognize them and see what those letters mean. I cannot translate this for you because I don't speak Roman, but there's definitely letters, and you can see as history's going on how there are things that we actually use that came from these ancient times. So here's another great example of a domed roof that is actually in Rome. So you can see over on the left, the outside, this is at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. It looks a lot like our Capitol building, but at the very top here, you can see that there's a cross. And of course, our government buildings wouldn't have a cross on top of them because we have separation of our church and state. But lots of cool things on here that are really indicative that it's Roman. So we definitely have columns. Look, all the way up here. These are in pairs, and they're more for decoration than anything. Also in pairs down here. And there is very ornate carving on the very tops of them. We definitely have the domed roof once again, because that was very common there. And then you check out these awesome statues. So we can see these sculptures up close, but I can tell you that this is really high up on St. Peter's Basilica. It's a church. Like if you're at the ground, you can't see the detail on these sculptures, but if you find pictures where it's actually zoomed in on them, you can totally see how much detail they put. So why would you want to put that much detail into something that you can't even see? Who's climbing up on top of the roof to look at that? So that shows you the pride that they had in their work, the detail and the realism. On the right-hand side, you can see the inside of this dome and what it looks like. So you guys did not get to go to Washington, D.C., but this is sort of what the inside of the Capitol dome actually looks like. There's lots of painting. If we looked at this and zoomed in, these paintings are in extreme detail. The color is fantastic, and you can see that it's all of these different pictures, so nothing is the same on this inside part. So this domed look and this building here are copied throughout the world in lots of different ways. So just like we copy the Parthenon for our architecture, we also use this domed and arches look. So the arches also lended to their science and engineering. So they were actually really, really smart and were able to create these aqueducts that we see here. So the aqueduct is basically a way to move water. You've got the arches that are going to support that, because not only is this a lot of stone, but water is super heavy. I don't know if you guys know that, but water's very heavy. So basically there would be a channel on the inside of here, and that's where the water would actually flow. So here's a little cartoon drawing that shows that. So you would have the city all the way down here, and it would be a little bit downhill from the original water source, which we see here. So that could be a lake, that could be a river. Even once they started damming water and holding it back, it could be in there. So we basically have a tube that gets dropped in. It is going to fill with water, and then that's going to flow down until eventually, of course, you're going to get to the city. Here's our aqueduct where that water actually travels. So it's like a bridge for the water. That's pretty much what it was. You do have these inspection shafts because people could actually go down into them in case they needed to, there was a blockage or something like that. They could go down into there if they needed to. Your settling tank is where you're actually going to have dirt and debris. If you have ever been swimming in a lake, for example, in Michigan, you know that there is definitely some debris and dirt and things that float in the water. Probably not something that you really want to drink, and so it would settle right here, and the water would continue to flow down this covered channel. This would have been covered across the top. Think about some people who have like covered gutters that have like the mesh on it. This would have had a solid cover because you wanted to make sure that you were keeping anything out of it. You didn't want to have leaves or anything like that that would end up in it. Then it ends up basically in a water tank. So you've probably seen water towers before. We have one in town. And from here, it gets distributed into small tanks in different places in the city. So the Romans were really famous for their giant baths. It's like a big, huge sort of warm pool where people would get together and talk about things. This would be one of the ways that they would have filled that up. We definitely have Greek ideas. So we had a Hellenistic philosopher. Of course, the Hellenistic period started with Julius Caesar. He says that the earth was the center of the universe. He was wrong, but he was pretty sure that that wasn't the case. We definitely created new laws. Roman law was very strict in some cases, but they came up with some things that might sound familiar. For example, you are innocent until proven guilty. That's something that we use in our legal system. The accused is allowed to face your accuser. We have that in our legal system as well. Now, they said that guilt had to be clearer than daylight. We say beyond a shadow of a doubt, but it's the same idea. You have to be 100% sure that that person is guilty, or they get off whatever the crime might be. So overall, there's a lot of stuff that the Romans managed to achieve. Lots of science. There's some literature that we skipped over, but a lot of it is stuff that we actually use today which is one of the reasons I wanted to make sure we talked about it today.